When we imagine biblical weddings, we often picture ceremonies filtered through centuries of tradition and modern sentiment. But step back 3,500 years into the harsh wilderness where Moses led Israel, and the reality becomes starkly different. Marriage in the time of Moses was not primarily about romance or individual choice. It was about survival, covenant, and the formation of a people under divine law. Every union carried the weight of tribal continuity, economic stability, and obedience to commandments that would either preserve or destroy the community. What we discover about these ancient marriage practices challenges our assumptions and reveals how deeply covenant theology shaped even the most intimate human relationships. In the scorching heat of Sinai, where water was scarce and survival uncertain, marriage served purposes far beyond personal happiness. It was a transaction that secured bloodlines, distributed resources, and maintained the delicate social order that kept 12 tribes unified under Moses' leadership. The desert offered no luxury for extended courtships or elaborate ceremonies. Every decision carried existential weight. A marriage arrangement meant the difference between a family's prosperity and its dissolution, between strong tribal alliances and dangerous isolation. These were not ceremonies of sentiment, but acts of strategic covenant-making that mirrored Israel's relationship with their God. The young woman, awakening on her wedding morning, faced responsibilities that would define not only her future, but the future of her clan. Marriage marked her transition from one household's protection to another's authority, but this transition occurred within a framework of divine law that Moses had established. The bride price, the witnessing rituals, the ceremonial elements, all operated under regulations that reflected God's character and Israel's covenant identity. Understanding these practices requires us to see marriage through the lens of Torah, where every aspect of human relationships served the larger purpose of creating a holy nation set apart for divine service. This morning, as she prepared for a ceremony that would reshape her entire existence, this bride participated in something far more significant than a personal milestone. She entered into a covenant structure that would teach generations about faithfulness, responsibility, and the sacred nature of commitment. The wedding practices of Moses' time were not primitive versions of modern romance. They were sophisticated expressions of a people learning to live under divine law while navigating the practical demands of nomadic survival. To understand these ceremonies is to glimpse how the teachings of Moses transformed even the most basic human relationships into expressions of covenant faithfulness. By examining the wedding customs of this pivotal period, we uncover how Moses' philosophy of law, covenant, and community responsibility shaped the most intimate aspects of Hebrew life. The marriage practices established during the wilderness wandering would influence Jewish tradition for millennia, but more importantly, they reveal how divine instruction penetrated every aspect of human experience. These were not merely cultural traditions, but theological statements about commitment, accountability, and the formation of covenant community under divine authority. The heat rising from sun-baked stones signaled another day in the wilderness camp, but today carried different weight. Families stirred earlier, voices carried farther, and the ordinary rhythm of survival gave way to preparation for covenant making. In the world of Moses, marriage represented far more than the union of two individuals. It embodied the very principles that held the covenant community together. As we explore these ancient practices, we discover how Moses' teachings about law, relationship, and divine authority created a framework for human commitment that would endure long after the desert wandering ended. Stay with us as we uncover how these ancient wedding customs reveal profound truths about covenant faithfulness that will transform how you understand both marriage and the deeper purposes of divine law and human community. The bride price negotiations had likely begun months before this wedding morning, involving fathers, tribal elders, and careful calculations of livestock, silver, and service obligations. In Moses' time, this was not crude bartering, but a sophisticated system that reflected both economic necessity and theological principle. The desert provided no banks, no written contracts beyond the Torah itself, and no enforcement mechanisms except tribal honor and divine law. Marriage arrangements required tangible exchanges that could sustain families through seasons of scarcity and establish the new household on firm foundation. The amount negotiated depended on multiple factors: the bride's family status, her skills in textile work and food preparation, the groom's ability to provide protection and resources, and the strategic value of joining these particular bloodlines. A skilled weaver might command a higher price, as textiles represented both daily necessity and trade commodity. A family with strong warriors might seek alliances with those possessing flocks or metalworking expertise. These calculations occurred within the moral framework Moses had established, where exploitation was forbidden and fair dealing was divine command. The groom's family gathered resources carefully, understanding that failure to meet the agreed bride price would bring shame and potentially isolate them within the tribal structure. They counted sheep, weighed silver pieces, and assessed their ability to provide the ceremonial garments and feast provisions expected. This was not merely economic transaction, but covenant making that required divine blessing and community witness. The bride price acknowledged the loss her family would suffer and the responsibility the groom's family accepted in receiving her. During negotiations, both families considered how this union would affect their standing within the larger camp structure Moses had organized. Marriage created new obligations for military service, ceremonial participation, and mutual support during the periodic migrations that characterized wilderness life. A family that consistently made poor marriage alliances might find itself marginalized when resources became scarce or when tribal councils made crucial decisions about routes, water rights, or conflict resolution. The theological dimension of bride price negotiations reflected Moses' teaching that all relationships operated under divine oversight. The commandments governing fair dealing, honest weights, and protection of the vulnerable applied directly to marriage arrangements. Fathers could not demand excessive payments that would impoverish the groom's family, nor could they accept inadequate compensation that failed to recognize their daughter's worth. The entire process required the kind of moral accountability that Moses demanded in all aspects of covenant community life. Payment often extended beyond the initial ceremony, with ongoing obligations that bound the families together across years. The groom might commit to provide specific services during harvest seasons, military campaigns, or ceremonial observances. These extended commitments created networks of mutual dependence that strengthened the overall tribal structure Moses worked to maintain. Marriage was never simply about two individuals, but about weaving together the complex relationships that enabled survival and covenant faithfulness. The bride's family prepared carefully for their role in the ceremony, understanding that their conduct would reflect not only on their household, but on their commitment to the moral standards Moses had established. They gathered ceremonial items, prepared feast contributions, and ensured that every aspect of their participation honored both their daughter and the covenant community that surrounded them. In the wilderness, where reputation meant survival, wedding preparations carried weight that extended far beyond a single day's celebration. 3 days before the ceremony, the ritual purification process began for both bride and groom, reflecting Moses' emphasis on holiness in all aspects of covenant life. This was not merely symbolic cleansing, but practical preparation that acknowledged the sacred nature of covenant making. In the desert camp, where water was precious, the allocation of resources for ceremonial washing demonstrated the community's commitment to maintaining the holy standards that set Israel apart from surrounding nations. The bride underwent washing rituals overseen by the older women of her family clan, who instructed her in the duties and responsibilities of married life within the covenant community. These women had learned from their own mothers the intricate balance required to maintain household purity while managing the practical demands of nomadic existence. They taught her the proper preparation of ceremonial foods, the maintenance of family textile production, and the complex social protocols that governed relationships between married women and the broader tribal structure. The groom's purification involved not only physical cleansing, but spiritual preparation that included fasting, prayer, and instruction from tribal elders about his new responsibilities as household head. The men who guided him understood that marriage in Moses' system created a new center of covenant accountability. The groom would now bear responsibility for ensuring his household's compliance with Torah regulations, their participation in required festivals, and their contribution to the community's spiritual and material welfare. Both families prepared special garments for the ceremony, often requiring weeks of careful textile work. The bride's wedding garment typically featured intricate embroidery that displayed her family's craftsmanship skills and economic resources. The patterns often incorporated symbols with theological significance, reflecting the understanding that this marriage occurred within the larger context of Israel's covenant relationship with God. The investment in these ceremonial clothes demonstrated the family's commitment to honoring both the occasion and the divine authority under which it occurred. The tent where the ceremony would take place received special attention, with carpets, hangings, and oil lamps arranged to create a space worthy of covenant making. This preparation required community cooperation as families shared resources and labor to ensure proper hospitality. The tent arrangement reflected Moses' instructions about creating holy space within the camp, acknowledging that marriage ceremonies, like all significant community events, occurred in God's presence and required appropriate reverence. Community elders prepared themselves to serve as witnesses, understanding that their role extended beyond mere observation to active participation in the covenant-making process. These men bore responsibility for ensuring that the ceremony conformed to the legal and spiritual standards Moses had established. They would later testify to the legitimacy of the union should questions arise about inheritance, tribal membership, or household authority. Their presence transformed a family celebration into a community covenant event. The ritual foods required for the feast demanded careful preparation according to the dietary laws Moses had established. Families coordinated to provide grain offerings, wine, oil, and meat that met the purity standards required for ceremonial consumption. The feast was not simply celebration, but communion meal that acknowledged God's provision and blessing on the new household. Every element of food preparation reflected the understanding that covenant people maintained holy standards even in their most joyful celebrations. The actual ceremony began at sunset, when the desert heat subsided and the camp's daily survival activities gave way to community gathering. The bride emerged from her family tent wearing the ceremonial garments that represented months of careful preparation, but her finery could not disguise the weight of responsibility she now accepted. Under Moses' system, marriage marked not graduation into personal freedom, but entry into a more complex web of covenant obligations that would define the rest of her existence. The processional moved slowly through the camp's carefully ordered sections, allowing the entire community to witness this new covenant formation. The bride's family accompanied her, singing traditional songs that celebrated not romance but faithfulness, endurance, and the blessing of offspring who would carry forward the covenant promise. The groom waited with his household, their faces reflecting the solemnity of men who understood that this moment created new lines of accountability before God and community. Tribal elders positioned themselves as official witnesses, their presence transforming private family negotiation into public covenant declaration. Under Moses' legal system, these witnesses bore ongoing responsibility for the marriage's legitimacy and the household's compliance with Torah standards. Their participation was not ceremonial flourish, but essential legal requirement that protected both families and maintained community order. The marriage could not proceed without their formal acknowledgement and blessing. The exchange of gifts occurred in full community view, demonstrating that the bride price negotiations had been completed according to righteous standards. The groom's family presented livestock, silver, textiles, and tools that would establish the new household's economic foundation. The bride's family offered household items, ceremonial objects, and their daughters carefully accumulated dowry. These exchanges reflected Moses' teaching that covenant relationships required tangible commitment and mutual responsibility. The ceremonial cup of wine passed between bride and groom represented their entry into shared covenant obligations. This was not romantic symbolism, but theological statement, acknowledging that their union occurred within the larger framework of Israel's relationship with God. The wine represented both celebration of God's provision and commitment to maintain the holy standards that set covenant people apart. By sharing the cup, they declared their intention to create a household that honored divine law and contributed to community welfare. The formal pronouncement by the eldest witness established the marriage's legal validity according to the standards Moses had instituted. This declaration invoked God's blessing while simultaneously acknowledging the divine authority under which the union was formed. The words spoken were not ornamental, but constitutive, creating new legal and spiritual realities that would govern the relationship for life. The entire community heard and acknowledged these vows, accepting their role in supporting and monitoring the new household's covenant faithfulness. The evening feast that followed provided the community's first opportunity to celebrate, while acknowledging the new household's place within the tribal structure. Families shared carefully prepared foods, offered blessings, and participated in traditional songs that reinforced the theological foundations underlying marriage in Moses' system. This celebration affirmed that individual happiness served the larger purpose of building covenant community capable of fulfilling God's purposes for Israel. Marriage in the time of Moses reveals the profound integration of practical necessity and theological conviction that characterized life under divine law. These ceremonies were neither primitive arrangements nor romantic idealization, but sophisticated expressions of a community learning to live as God's covenant people in the harsh realities of wilderness existence. The wedding practices, established during this foundational period, reflect Moses' understanding that every aspect of human relationship must serve the larger purpose of creating a holy nation capable of fulfilling divine mandate. The bride price negotiations, purification rituals, community witness, and ceremonial exchanges all reinforce the same fundamental principle that Moses emphasized throughout his leadership. Covenant faithfulness requires both individual commitment and community accountability. Marriage was not escape from tribal responsibility, but deeper entry into the network of relationships that sustained Israel's identity as God's chosen people. The elaborate preparations and formal procedures served to create households capable of transmitting covenant values across generations while maintaining the practical cooperation necessary for survival. These ancient practices challenge modern assumptions about marriage as primarily personal fulfillment rather than covenant responsibility. In Moses' system, individual happiness served larger purposes of community welfare and divine obedience. The theological weight placed on marriage ceremonies reflected the understanding that healthy households formed the foundation of covenant community capable of fulfilling God's purposes for Israel. The careful attention to legal procedures, economic exchanges, and community witness created stability that enabled the covenant people to flourish despite the challenges of nomadic existence. Understanding weddings in Moses' time illuminates how divine law penetrated the most intimate aspects of human relationship, transforming private arrangements into expressions of covenant faithfulness. The marriage practices established during the wilderness, wandering created patterns that would influence Jewish tradition for millennia, while demonstrating how Moses' philosophy of law, community, and divine accountability shaped every dimension of Hebrew life. These ceremonies reveal that covenant theology was not abstract doctrine, but practical framework for creating relationships capable of enduring hardship while maintaining holy standards. The legacy of these marriage practices extends beyond historical curiosity to contemporary understanding of commitment, accountability, and the sacred nature of covenant relationships. By examining how Moses' teachings shaped wedding customs, we glimpse the profound integration of faith and daily life that characterized covenant community at its formation. These ancient ceremonies invite us to consider how our own understanding of marriage and commitment reflects or departs from the theological foundations that Moses established for God's people. As you reflect on these insights into ancient wedding practices, consider subscribing to join our community of believers committed to understanding how historical context deepens biblical faith. Share this exploration with others who seek to comprehend how Moses' teachings continue to illuminate our understanding of covenant relationship and divine purpose in human community.